So now I'm going to look at Anselm's Proslogion, chapter 3, and that's the chapter that's titled "That He Cannot Be Thought Not to Exist." Okay, so the chapter 2 was on that God exists. So that's where we see the meat of what's called the ontological argument. Okay, and Anselm there makes a case for why, if you understand God as something than which nothing greater can be thought, right? If you understand that, then you must understand that God does exist in reality. All right, now chapter 3 is a slightly different argument. So it's built on chapter 2, right? But it has its own sort of unique flavor to it. So I'll read the first paragraph, which is the key, the meat of the argument. It says, "This being exists so truly that it cannot be thought not to exist." Okay, so that's what he's saying. That's his claim. "For it is possible to think that something exists that cannot be thought not to exist." Right? So he's saying it is possible to think that something exists that cannot be thought not to exist. Right? Another way of saying is that it is possible to think that something exists necessarily. Right? There must be something, that there has to be something, a thing, right, that is there, and you can never think that it's not there. It's just there, right? So he's saying that's possible to think about that. Okay, and that's the key here. That it's possible to think. So it's a logically coherent idea. Excuse me. Or concept. Okay. So it is possible to think that something exists necessarily. That means he's saying it's a logically coherent idea or concept. And he goes on, so he says, "For it's possible to think that something exists that cannot be thought not to exist, and such a being is greater than one that can be thought not to exist." Right? So this being that exists necessarily is greater than something that does not exist necessarily. So this necessary being, okay, is greater than a being that can be conceived of as not existing, which is essentially everything that's a creature, every creature, essentially. All right. Therefore, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not that than which a greater cannot be thought. And this is a contradiction. So that than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly that it cannot be thought not to exist. Okay, that's clear enough. So just let's outline what he's saying here. So let me see if I could use some numbers here. Right, so let's say 1, he's saying that it is logically coherent to think that something exists that cannot be thought not to exist. Okay, so that's basically restating that. Okay, so let's, I'm just going to say this like 1a here. Let's call it x. All right, and then we'll say it is logically coherent to think that something exists that can be thought to not exist. Right, so you're saying that there's some things that you can actually think of them not existing. So me, you, anything, basically anything we encounter, right? False. So let's call them y. So X is a set of things that you can necessary, and Y is a set of things that can be thought not to exist. All right, so the point here is that X and Y are mutually exclusive sets. Okay, so this means that you can't logically belong to both, right? Because things in set Y are a negation or opposite to things in set X, right? So it's like saying I am here and not here, right? So let's just think of X and Y. If I said X is the set of all things that are here, and Y is the set of all things that are not here, those are mutually exclusive sets because you're either here or not here. You can't be both in the same respect. Okay, and so that's the same thing here, is that you have two mutually exclusive sets. X is the set of all things that exist that cannot be thought not to exist, necessary things. Y is the set of all things that can be thought to not exist, so all these non-necessary beings, right? So I am, you are, I am, the building you're in, the iPod or iPhone you have, your cup, everything falls that we sort of encounter falls into this set of Y things, right? It's possible to conceive of a world without us. All right. So the next step of his argument is essentially that X, this set of necessary beings, okay, is greater than Y, right? Or to be more precise, anything that belongs to X is greater than anything that belongs to Y, right? So he's saying if you take something that belongs to this set that's a necessary being, it's always going to be greater than something that is not a necessary being. All right, so let's spell this out just a little more. So, so just as existing in reality is greater than not existing in reality. So this he established from chapter 2. Okay. The possibility of not existing at some point. So if you're not a necessary being, that means there's some point you didn't exist, right? So I was born at some point, I'm going to die at some point. The earth came into existence at some point, and it's going to die at some point. The universe came into existence at some point. At some point, that big crunch, it's going to die out, right? So the possibility of not existing at some point in your at some point in time, let me just say in time, is less than the necessity of existing at all times, right? So the fact that you have beings who at some point in time don't exist means that they're less than a being that exists at all times, right? So that's how Anselm is setting this up. So having made these points, now he's going to basically use what's called a proof by contradiction. So here you want to assume the premise you want to disprove, okay, and let it lead you to an absurdity or contradiction. All right, so the proof by contradiction is just a style of proof that if you want to prove something, right? If I want to prove that I am not here, well, I'll assume the opposite, right? I'll assume that I am. Now, excuse me. If I want to prove that I am here, right, where I am right now, if I want to prove that, I assume the opposite and say I am not here, and then I just follow that proof all the way until it leads me to some sort of contradictory statement, something that's absurd, and then I realize that line of thinking is completely wrong, and then I just go with the other half of the disjunctive, with the other premise. So that's what he's going to do here. He's going to say if, okay, that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, if that thing could be thought not to exist, then it would belong to Y. All right. Okay, but we've already said that X and Y are mutually exclusive, right? That means you can't logically belong to both X and Y, right? You can't be a necessary being and a non-necessary being, right? And so if that which nothing greater can be thought, which we define as belonging to X, if we say it can be thought not to exist, then that means it also belongs to Y. But X and Y are mutually exclusive. That statement, that than which is defined as X, or belonging to the set X, right? Okay. Now that was originally defined as such, and but if we assume this premise, let's just see, just clarify this, was already defined as X. Okay, so if we assume then that than which nothing greater can be thought to exist can be thought not to exist, then that means it would belong to Y. Okay, but it was already defined as X. That's what we inherently defined it, and X and Y are mutually exclusive, and then thus we have a contradiction. Okay. And I'll put this here. Okay. Thus we abandon the premise that than which belongs to Y. Okay, and then at this point, what we'll say is that than which nothing greater can be thought belongs only to X, right? And what are we saying here? We're saying it cannot be thought not to exist. All right, so I know there's some X and Y's here and some mathematical or logical symbols like greater and less than, but hopefully this tries to clear this up, right? So think of the first part as sort of setting up things and defining things, right? And setting up his assumptions, and then the proof by contradiction is he's going to assume the opposite of what he wants to prove, that than which nothing greater can be thought actually can be thought not to exist, but then you have that will put it in a set of things that's mutually exclusive to what it is internally. Okay, and then you have an absurdity or a contradiction, and that means you have to abandon this other premise and go with the original one, go with the other half of the premise, right? So you abandon this, number 6, and just say it can't belong to Y, it must only belong to X. Okay. All right, so I'll just read this again. So hopefully this makes sense. So he starts again with this claim: this being exists so truly that it cannot be thought not to exist. Okay, that's his claim. It says, for it is possible to think that something exists that cannot be thought not to exist. All right, so that's what we're doing here first. Okay, and such a being is greater than one that can be thought not to exist. Okay, and that's this here. Okay, so I'm filling out 2 and 3 are just basically things that he's not saying, but I'm sort of filling them out. And then this step 4 is what we just read. Therefore, then now he's going to prove by contradiction. Therefore, if that than which a greater can be thought not to exist. Okay, that's number 6. Right, you just assume the opposite of what you're trying to prove. Then that that than which a greater cannot be thought is not that than which a greater cannot be thought, right? Because he's saying at this point, then we put it in. We have a sort of a contradiction here, right? Because we put it in two mutually exclusive sets. Okay, so he says, I'll read that sentence again. Therefore, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not that than which a greater cannot be thought. And this is a contradiction. So that than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly that it cannot be thought not to exist. Okay, and that's sort of the conclusion I have here in 7. All right, so just trying to follow out the argument and trying to fill in a few steps here that he assumes, right, that embedded in the argument, and hopefully this makes this a little clearer.